It hasn't even started, and I'm... good morning. Welcome to Trooper 16. Every year I have a, say, more or less exact plan what to say in these moments, and every year it's blown away, right away. Welcome to Troopers. And for some of you, this is, well, I would even say, for the majority of you, this is welcome back. We are very happy to have you again in Heidelberg for these days of InfoSec education, to put it mildly, and to have quite some fun. And actually, I could pretty much immediately stop right this, what Troopers is about, and just cite this nice tweet that... Thank you, Adrian, for this. This pretty much summarizes what Troopers is about. It's a kind of family reunion. You don't have to fix your parents' Wi-Fi. You might have to, like, fiddle with other types of technical stuff. But this gives an idea of what Troopers is about. And for those of you who are here for the first time, by tradition, I will very quickly introduce what this is about. First, you might ask, who's running this? It's run by ER&W, an information security and consulting services company based in Heidelberg, which is why Troopers is in Heidelberg. And since the 1st of January, there's a slight change. It's no longer just ER&W, like mothership, but there is two additional companies, which I'd like to quickly announce. That is ER&W Research, where we have bundled all types of research activities, mostly those BMBF-funded programs we take part in. You will see some things from ER&W Research during Troopers. And there is ER&W Insight, where we have bundled the activities when it comes to training and knowledge transfer. And actually, ER&W Insight is the party running Troopers. So these are the guys who have set up all this, and you will get an idea what they do during those 2 days. That said, next question might be for the, say, newcomers, why Troopers? Or why do you run this event? The answer is quite simple. Look at this. In parallel, CeBIT is going on in Hannover. In the earlier years, we tried to avoid a conflict with CeBIT. Since some years, we don't any longer, as we feel it's different types of audiences. And from this article about CeBIT, spot the keywords. Industry 4.0, which is a German term for like digitalization of manufacturing and industry sectors. Big data, IoT, it's all this stuff. And we think, and we thought when we established Troopers, there must be, say, some, I might say, watchdogs. It helps if there is a group of people who not just take a very positive, affirmative look at technologies, but at some points question, are these the right technologies? Are these technologies secure? Are these technologies, in the way they exist, suited to help our lives? And we understand what Troopers does as a kind of watchdog. You might interpret your role like this guy. You might interpret it like this guy. I won't, I leave it to your speculation what's in the barrels. So a watchdog is needed. And we thought Troopers is the event for these watchdogs. And Troopers, one important element about Troopers is, it's not just like people standing in front, like rock star speakers and delivering something, delivering a message, technical content like from the pulpit, but it's about all of us, it's about you. This slide is actually taken from last year's opening remarks, so some of you might know this. Just from the numbers, there is a high chance that right now the guy next to you, sitting next to you, is a speaker or an ex-speaker. This person, while certainly having knowledge of something special, is not like a rock star. It's Troopers like you are. So Troopers is about interaction. keep this in mind. Keep this in mind whatever you do. Talk with people, interact with them, discuss technical stuff. I'm even tempted to recommend that during the dinner tonight, you don't sit next to your colleagues you share the office with the whole year. Sit at another table, talk to the guys. This might be even more fun than talking to your colleagues. It's about interaction. There is some special things about troopers that some of you might know, the others, the newcomers, don't. There is a type of what we call challenges, little games where you can collect points by solving technical tasks and challenges. These points can be used, you can collect them for fun and competition. They will go into a lottery, which takes place tomorrow. There is a charity program which we run in parallel. Some of you might have observed what the last year's charity of about 8K euros was spent for. There is several ways to contribute to that one. One way is the in the interim legend 10K run. Next morning, for every kilometer spent, we will put 5 euros into the charity. So every runner, every kilometer, and it's fun to run in the morning, anyway. And there is some more stuff, as you will notice in the next days. But this is a conference, so at the core of the conference still is the talks, which is why I suggest we welcome our speakers. Can we fix this? Okay. Not sure what's going on. Okay. In my early days as an instructor, I learned what separates an excellent trainer from a good trainer is how to handle unexpected situations. And one thing I learned is just keep on talking. But I would like to. Can you? Okay.
I believe you've forgotten the most important speaker, don't you think?
Okay, I'm confused. Whatever happened right now. Well, I would like to welcome Ben, who's our keynote speaker. I'm confused right now. This is, Ben is, I saw him last year at the RIPE conference talking about ethics of network security or network research in general. And I immediately was struck and thought there is a very important thing he's doing, which is I'm very happy to have you here today. Welcome to Heidelberg. Welcome to Troopers.
Thank you.
Happy to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks. I know. Thank you. So that was close to being the coolest introduction I've ever had. And then that weird fish logo appears again. I had some things in my hotel room with that fish logo as well. So anyway, I'm Ben Zevenbergen. I'm from the Oxford Internet Institute from the local university there. And I'm here to talk about ethics. I'm not one of you. I don't publish technical reports. I'm not a computer scientist. But I'm looking at the ethics in network systems research in particular. So I'm here to talk about a project that I'm currently doing. I've been doing this project for about 2 years now, organizing events all over the world with engineers and philosophers and lawyers, trying to get together to really understand the ethics of computer science and network systems research. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to establish some practical guidelines for network engineers. And what we found is that the best way to think about ethics is have some multidisciplinary reflexivity. Engineers don't generally do ethics that well when they sit by themselves in their room in front of their computer, often with self-serving biases and stuff. So just a quick introduction. I'm a lawyer. Yeah, sorry. So educated in the Netherlands. I was in the Dutch Order of Lawyers. I did information law. I was instantly grabbed by the regulation and governance of internet technologies and the gap that you see there between what's happening in the real world and what the laws are regulating. So I went to become a lawyer at one of these hip law firms that only worked with startups. Great fun. But what I found that it was really difficult to actually apply the laws to the internet. You've got copyright from 300 years ago, data protection, kind of the principles from the 70s and the 80s. These are all laws from different technological eras, and we're trying to apply them to these highly complex interconnected networks that didn't exist when these laws were being written. What also didn't help was judges. Now, you got to keep in mind, judges are extremely powerful. They can make decisions, sending you to jail, imposing huge fines, regulating, setting precedents to regulate the environment around you. Generally, they're very good. They're very thoughtful. But what happens when you come to a judge with an internet case is not only are you trying to apply the laws from a different technological era, but you're also speaking to people from a different technological era. And I don't mean to insult them, but it's like basically having your mother trying to decide a complex case. Now, I'm not sure how technical your mother is, but I don't think I'd like my mother to sit there and make these big decisions. One little story just to illustrate this. There was this case happening. It was a very standard case, this holiday review home website. Two parties went to court because one party had left some bad reviews about a neighbor. So they were competing or something, and they were trying to figure out whether the email address that had left those comments was actually that person. So we had to go to the judge to get a warrant to find whether the IP address and the email address matched. So we were there at the court arguing. And say, for example, it was Enno and Nikki arguing. And it was Enno at hotmail.com and Nikki at gmail.com. And at some point, the judge was just looking through his notes and started looking confused. He said, stop. We're like, what's wrong? It's quite a simple case. And he said, well, you're talking about Enno, you're talking about Nikki, you're talking about Ed. Who's Ed? There's nothing in my notes about Ed. We were like, okay, well, we weren't talking about Ed. And he's Nikki at gmail.com, Enno at hotmail.com, who is Ed? So you sound like, you're like, okay, time out. Let's explain how an email address works. And this kept recurring. So at some point, I got the offer to work in politics. And I thought, it's great working with the legislator and regulators, shaping these laws, informing them a bit more. So I went to the European Parliament, and some of the things I worked on was the ACTA treaty, for example, endless copyright enforcement measures that aren't actually particularly useful, actually more harming. We implemented net neutrality in the Netherlands, and we tried in Europe, but that hasn't gone quite so well. But yeah, so politicians are often very good people that try to understand the issues. But again, they're like judges. Oftentimes you meet people like this. I'm not familiar precisely with exactly what I said, but I stand by what I said, whatever it was. Now, if you hear if you hear that, you know they've been informed by someone somewhere, and they said, you know, that they're in a deal to sort of protect these kind of things. I wasn't actually in a room when this was being said by that particular person, but a very similar story to the last one. We were working on this ACTA treaty. You know, if you don't know it, it was an international treaty organized by states and written mainly by lobbyists, actually, over about 8 years to increase the fines and the penalties for copyright violations on the internet. Likely something like constant surveillance of the internet would be a thing to make sure that they can pick out the copyright violations. And one of the European commissioners, I won't say his name because this was a closed meeting, but one of the European commissioners had signed the treaty for the EU, and then went to the parliament and just said, you know, guys, can you just ratify this? Because, you know, it's good for the world. The internet's the Wild West, so we have to regulate it. So we had a big argument back and forth, and he started, you know, hammering his hand on the table, saying, this is important, we need to do this. And at some point, the meeting was more or less over, the microphone was still on, and he turned to his friend, and he said that, you know, one good thing about this whole ACTA treaty is that my assistants have taught me to use the internet, because, you know, before they could just handle the calendar and the emails and that kind of stuff. But suddenly, so many people were writing emails to politicians to stop this treaty. It was literally hundreds per hour at some point that you know, politicians tried to reply themselves to people. So what he was saying is, you know, like, it's really great. What you do is you like click on a message and you press reply and you like type the thing. When you press send, it goes to them instantly. And his friend next to him was like, oh yeah, that's great. So, and then we were, you know, the younger policy advisors and some of the younger politicians who kind of get the internet. We're sitting there and we switched our microphones back on. We said, okay, did you actually just admit that you've never used the internet, but you have signed an international treaty on behalf of the EU to regulate this thing? And he said, well, yeah, you know, like, I don't have to use it, but I know, you know, I've got people informing me. Those kind of informations. So, and then, you know, that was kind of one of the moments when the whole ACTA treaty started falling apart, when we saw that the people who are actually trying to regulate the internet don't have a clue what they're talking about. And I did find in politics that I was working with lots of engineers, and I really enjoyed the sort of back and forth, trying to explain technology to politicians. But I felt like I needed to know more about it. So I went to academia, to the Internet Institute. It's a multidisciplinary institute. My supervisor is a computer scientist, and I work with lots of network engineers, but also philosophers and geographers and sociologists and you name it, and me as a lawyer. We joined this EU-funded network of excellence, beautiful name, but it was a 3-year project to inform the European Commission about what the internet actually is, what regulation does, and my current project is funded by the Open Technology Fund, which is a US State Department-funded Internet Freedom Fund. I'm not sure if you remember Hillary Clinton about 6-7 years ago promoting internet freedom everywhere. This is where she put the money where her mouth was, and I got some of that. So this was great, you know, working in academia, I'm really exploring the middle ground between the soft world where I come from with laws and regulations and the more hard world where you guys come from. I'd like to tell a funny story here as well about, you know, a confused professor or something. But actually, the funny story here is you. This is a mirror, or an image of a mirror. If I wasn't the first speaker, I would have quickly taken a picture and like, edited it in. But okay, I don't mean to insult anyone. I really come here in peace. But I do want to reflect a little bit on what I've seen when working with engineers, especially when you know, projects are involving humans or collecting data about humans. One thing I see often, this is just a quick introduction, is So you've got these ethical concepts, ethical theories. I'm sure some of you know them. I won't go into very much detail. But the engineering mindset is often a consequentialist one, utilitarianism, where the end justifies the mean. You know, you're incentivized to create a project, or you're writing a paper, you're doing a study, you're doing a research, and it doesn't really matter how you get to the end. Now, this is generalizing very much, I know that, but in general, you can see that it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get there, as long as the system is efficient, as long as it's fast, as long as the database has, that the database contains the data that you need. How you got there, which technical sort of tricks you pulled, it's interesting, but you don't really think too much about what those things actually mean. So where I come from, where the philosophy and the lawyers and currently social scientists, we are sort of more deontologists. So we don't necessarily judge a project by the end result. We judge a project by the steps that are taken to get there and the effects that it has. I'll go through some examples of this in a second. But I just wanted to show you this difference, and maybe you recognize yourself in the first one. Maybe you actually recognize yourself in the second one, or probably somewhere in between. But what I've seen on the wide spectrum, most engineers that I work with are more on the end justifies the means side of things. So here's a good sort of Venn diagram that was drawn for me. I was when I started this work on ethics, I was more or less adopted by the internet measurement community. So it's not quite the security community, but they drew this for me when I started writing my first set of guidelines. And here you see that big difference. You know, useful internet research. That's a consequentialist kind of thing. You know, more people are going to have benefits from what I do than that people are going to be harmed. And then you've got this annoying user privacy laws that are just confusing. No one really understands them. You need some legal training to actually make sense of this all. And they conflict. And in the middle, you've got this interesting space, which I kind of call the ethical gap. I'm not only talking about privacy, but it's the ethical gap where these ways of thinking collide. And the question is, who rules the ethics gap? You know, we've got all these people trying to rule it. You've got the politicians, the lawyers, the engineers, and other groups as well. And everyone's got their super skills. You know, lawyers put people in jail. Politicians, they can even start wars if they want to. Engineers design the whole technical infrastructure of the internet. So, you know, who actually is it? And that's the question I kind of want to talk about a bit today. What we've been doing over the last probably two and a half years is organizing these workshops to sort of get an understanding of how people reason about this ethics gap. Engineers in the room, together with philosophers and lawyers, sometimes also social scientists. And we've done this all over the world. Lots in Canada, the US, all over Europe, Australia recently. Unfortunately, not Africa and Asia, but you know, budgets were a bit limited. And what we did is we asked engineers to take the stage and explain one of the projects they're working on where they're faced with a moral dilemma. Now, what you often saw was this consequentialist reasoning. You know, this is a great project, this is what we want to achieve, these are the benefits, this is the cool technology that we're using, and therefore this project's awesome. And then we'd ask the philosophers and the lawyers to kind of reflect on what was just being said and think about the effects and ask some questions. And to do that, the end result was kind of to see like where does this reasoning overlap, where does it completely diverge, and which kind of questions trigger people to really start understanding the other side of the thinking about this kind of stuff. One of the outcomes was, I think the main outcome actually, so you have these two superheroes, one being more super than the other probably. And here I've got the engineers being Robin, you know, saying, watch me solve all the world's problems. You know, my aim is to solve this and this and this problem, say freedom of speech for all Chinese people by measuring their censorship and creating tools to circumvent it. But then these philosophers and these lawyers would say, you know, the internet's actually a socio-technical system. It's not just a technical system. What you do isn't just a technical challenge. It may used to have been when there were 128 nodes or something back in the 70s, whatever it was. Throughout the 80s, likely it was all very much a technical challenge, what people, when you experimented on the internet. I guess that also counts for finding vulnerabilities, for example. But right now, 2016, and I guess over the last 20 years or so, everyone uses the internet for pretty much everything. There are very little activities that I do without coordinating it over the internet, communicating with friends, family, whatever, doing my banking, my government relations stuff. It's pretty much everything any human in developed countries does at the moment goes over the internet. So if you're collecting data from the internet, you're likely collecting human behavior. If you're manipulating environments, you're likely manipulating people's environments, living human beings, not just their technical devices. If you're measuring, for example, censorship blocks or something, these blocks have been put there by political entities to stop their citizens from gaining certain information. That's a very human and messy thing. So if you start tampering with that, you're actually tampering with politics and not just this technical block. So yeah, what we saw in these workshops is lawyers and philosophers like to give engineers a little slap. The slaps go back and forth, don't worry. But another thing that we kept seeing is engineers thought their technologies were neutral. It's, they design it and then it's up to people how they use it. Lawyers and philosophers quickly argued that that's absolutely not the case. When you're designing a project, you've got some choices in technology, in the scope of the project. If you're talking about research and the research question asked, for example, and the methodology used. So you're in a position of power to actually influence this social technical world that's the internet, which gives you a moral responsibility, if you accept that. But we saw there's a huge lack of communication about this, especially about the power position. So we needed some more the normative reflexivity from different disciplines. Just a few quotes. So often you see this from engineers. No matter how it's used, it has positive and negative consequences. What I often hear is, my technology is like a knife. You can use it to cut vegetables, or you can use it to kill people. But knives aren't illegal, and knives haven't really been redesigned. That's true, but then there's a lot of other strands that say, technologies are not just neutral. And what's important is to think about the social and economic systems, or to add to that political as well, in which they are embedded. How the technology is used depends really much on the context. So I was in Sydney a while ago. I went to a blockchain conference. I was invited as an ethicist to give a talk. So I flew 23 hours, and then I landed at 6:30, and at 9 I was on the stage to talk to blockchain engineers about ethics. And now I'm Robin. I stand there on the stage, jet-lagged, exhausted, and I kind of talked about how technologies are neutral. And this one guy, after about 3 minutes, a very typical engineer, German actually as well, long hair, Metallica t-shirt. I don't see any Metallica shirts here, I think. But he raises his hand and he says, "I fundamentally disagree with everything that you've said until now." Good. Which, because he really had that strong engineering mindset. So we started discussing a bit, and he would not be moved. Some people in the audience started discussing with him, and we agreed to talk about it later, and we did a few days later. And throughout this conference, we had a workshop at the beginning. So during the workshop, I would sit with all the different engineers and just talk about what it is they're developing and why they're developing systems on the blockchain. This is not Bitcoin. This is the new applications. And what I was trying to do is tease out the assumptions that people had and trying to see whether I could use this to go back to this one guy and say, like, here you go. This is why it's not neutral. So I've copied some of my notes here just from that day. I edited them a little bit, but this is basically what I was writing up. So these blockchain engineers, they like decentralization, disintermediation, transparency, trustless systems, interoperability. They're more on the next slide. But if you then look at my comments next to it, decentralization often leads to scale-free power laws, which can often lead to inequalities. You actually start centralizing power in a more diverse group than the original decentralization, but still you're creating inequalities. And you can't really control that. Disintermediation is nice, moving away from centralized institutions. But what about consumer rights? Who's accountable in these systems? Transparency is great, but what about privacy? What about trade secrets? These are things that people hold dear. Trustless systems sounds great, but if I was going to put my money in the bank, if I had money, then I would trust, or I'd rather have it in an accountable bank rather than these cryptocurrencies that are volatile. Here are a few more, self-organization. Self-organization sounds great, but all these people that I was speaking to were very sort of techno-libertarian. So would that mean that all these self-organized entities, would they be programmed with those values in mind? Many other things. So what I was trying to achieve with with taking these notes was showing this one guy and getting back to him and saying what you're actually doing is you're causing power shifts in society by developing these systems. If you want to do this because you want to decrease the power of the banks or central governments or whatever, then you're actually more or less attacking institutions, or you're giving the tools to decrease the power of these institutions and give more power to individuals or new organizations. And then he started thinking that, yeah, actually, that's exactly what he wants. He wants to decrease the power of these organizations, and that has a big social impact. So this is just a quick example of one of these discussions I had. I'm not saying he's right, I'm not saying I'm right, but this is just a way to kind of think about it a bit more differently than just stating, I'm apolitical, so therefore my technologies are also apolitical. This was my slap back at him. He goes, I'm inherently apolitical. Nope, you're not. So this is something I found on the internet earlier, but it's, I think here's another superhero. This could be the judge, could be the politician, but it could also be the engineer. And all of these parties have great power in regulating the internet. I fully agree with probably all of you that judges and politicians, when they regulate this stuff, they really need a thorough understanding of the technology. That's the responsibility that they should be taking, and some of them are, but very few. But on the other hand, engineers should also take this responsibility to understand the social world, to understand the messy political world, to understand power structures, to understand what data means for people in a particular context. If you're collecting data with a certain script here in Europe and you're using the same script in China or in Uganda, for example, the data collected, if breached or if found by anyone else or if shared with your research results, can mean very different things for the Chinese and Ugandans than to us Europeans or Americans. So this is the main message that I want to bring across, that you really, if you're going to collect data or manipulate environments, you do have to understand what it is that you're doing in the social world. And luckily, the project I'm working on is trying to set up some guidelines for this and how to think about this, how to speak to lawyers and how to speak to other stakeholders about this. So just to recap quickly, we've found that this engineering mindset is no longer sufficient for internet technologies, and that's because of the mediating role the internet currently has in the social world. Unexpected consequences can be huge. Oftentimes we've seen engineers working on a thing, not really thinking about the consequences except for their research aim and the benefits that they're going to create, and having this sort of tunneled vision and ignoring all the other effects that could be, or sort of trying to say that, what we are trying this and that's just an unfortunate consequence. So what we're trying to say is it's important to know what you don't know. That counts for lawyers, counts for politicians, and it counts for engineers. And the only way to really get there, unless you're sort of a Batman who knows everything, but it's through multidisciplinary reflexivity. So what I wanted to do is just go through 3 other cases with you to kind of see where teasing out some of these ideas, and I'd like to see if you agree fully with the technologists or whether the philosophical views actually resonate with you. So the first one, exploiting vulnerabilities. This is a topic that I understand many of you are working on. I just want to use this example. I've presented this before, I think, at NSO, but I don't think the rest has seen it. I'm sure you know it, the Karna botnet from 2012. Does anyone not know it? Okay, I'll just explain it very briefly. So anonymous researchers here, they created a sort of botnet, a self-replicating botnet that would find vulnerabilities, and oftentimes this would be a username and password that was standardized in Linux systems, and would enter these systems, check the local network, and try and replicate itself to other systems in that network. And I think it was after a year of running, they infiltrated 400, 500,000 systems, which were, industrial control systems, security doors, people's laptops, corporate servers, whatever. They got into a lot of places. And with that data, they created a huge map of the internet through the illegal use of 500,000 devices. I think this is a copy from the paper. And it's great, best data set to understand the topology of the internet network. I added some emojis there, but this is kind of like a Batman argument, The design principle was be nice and don't break things. You're going into 500,000 devices illegally, then that's I wonder whether that would hold in court. And then this sort of angel, all of that data that we gathered during the research is released into the public domain for further study. I guess, it can make you feel like an angel in your ivory tower. But the questions from the audience were, or from the philosophers were, do you actually know who the stakeholders were? Who owned the devices? You were going into all these devices, but do you actually have a clue what the responsibility of these devices were? What is it? If you're releasing this data with your projects, what are you actually releasing? What does this data actually mean? There was absolutely no sort of reflexivity of which systems they'd entered and what that would mean for those systems if their IP addresses, for example, would be released. Can you justify breaking the laws? Oftentimes we hear arguments where people say, well, we're doing good and this law is bad anyway and these politicians don't get it, so therefore we're going to go save the world now. Or using that censorship measurement stuff, we're going to create the tools for the Chinese to get freedom of speech. More on that later. But, you need a bit more than that. You can't just say like, well, all this is stupid, so therefore we can break the laws. Is it a precedent to set? This is a particularly important one with this particular case. I think there's quite a lot of research now that points to the Karna botnet, saying, look at what these guys did, great idea. We've done the same thing, but we've just tweaked it a little bit, and instead of not breaking things, we're just going to break this one little thing, or just collect this one extra bit of data, or use this as an excuse to be allowed to create botnets to scan vulnerabilities. But the philosopher said is that, if this is accepted, if this is used, then anyone can basically use it. And incrementally, people will start adding things to these botnets. So instead of just being self-replicating, they're going to do all sorts of other things. Good bugs can be exploited. So the lawyers and the philosophers really said to the researchers, stop doing this. This isn't a good idea. In line with the stakeholders, do you actually know what the harms are that you're causing by this kind of stuff? I mean, it's one thing to say, like, we're breaching privacy without really understanding privacy. But it's another thing to breach privacy in China, for example. It's a totally different legal and political context. So you've really got to sort of understand and define the harms that you're likely going to do. And then you've actually got to identify them as well to justify why you're doing these harms. So instead of just running this botnet and just letting it go, it's actually, you do have some moral responsibility to figure out what could likely happen and how do you mitigate these issues. But on the other hand, the philosopher said, what's the ethical cost of not having this information? We've got it now. It's hugely useful. It's being used to influence policy debates. So that's another thing to think about. It's kind of flipping it on its head. Another outcome is, I'm not quite sure if these are the same researchers, but there was a similar research recently where the methods have been redesigned to not be illegal. So it seems to be going forward. Well, one question I do have, and I'm not informed enough about this, but would this have inspired the way Showdown works and the way baby monitors were accessed? I don't have the answer. You may have the answer to this. But I just want to raise a point here that if you see this and you're this guy and you have his mental framework of what the internet is, and you're a strong leader, or you try to be perceived as a strong leader, and your voters confront you with this, and you're in a technology committee in the parliament or something, what you then do is you find out what this is, their vulnerability scanners, and then you prosecute them, or you create laws and rules to stop any vulnerability searching going on anymore. And you do your very best to at least be perceived by your voters that you're doing something about this. And if you're technically uninformed, like, I'm not talking about this guy in particular, but just the person that he stands for, you will probably get it wrong with writing these laws. So I think there's a big responsibility for this community to think about the precedents that you're setting and also deal with the people in your community who are doing these kind of things. Another example, one that I was recently confronted with, was researchers increasingly using hacked data. And I'm talking not very much about the technical researchers, but sort of more on the convergence of social science and technology. The Ashley Madison hack is, of course, analyzed by anyone and everyone, and lots of bad things happened because of those analyses as well. But here's another case. So this is, I'm not sure if you know it, Patreon. It's a sort of a crowdfunding website mainly used for people who create webcomics and those kind of internet creativity projects. And it was hacked. It's not a very big site. It wasn't that much data that was leaked, but there was a lot of personal information there. People, people's identified people about what they'd pledged to which project, comments, this kind of stuff, messages going back and forth. And I was speaking to one of the technical researchers who wanted to analyze this data. And he said, he'd been trying to look at Patreon for a while, but he couldn't quite, get in there. There wasn't a good oversight of all their projects. So he said, this data hack was like a gift. So, that's one way to think of it. But we talked about a few issues, and when we talked about privacy, he said, the entire site was hacked and exported, and I don't see how currently anyone could have an expectation of privacy anymore. I'm not trying to torture the definition, it's just it was private until it wasn't. Which is one way to think about privacy, but not the right way, unfortunately. So some of the things that I then in this conversation said back to him is, it doesn't matter where the data comes from for this particular thing, but if you are processing data, analyzing data that is linkable to identifiable people, you're likely breaching privacy and data protection laws. There's a lot more to it than that, but likely you're breaching it. Also, the expectation of privacy thing doesn't hold because people had an expectation of privacy when they gave the data to that website. They signed or they agreed to the terms and conditions, and it was between the user and that particular website. So when then that data is breached, the uses, for example, research uses resulting from that data leak were not foreseen by the people at the time. So that kind of, in the definition of that particular situation of privacy, that wasn't taken into account. So you can't say now it's breached, you can't have an expectation of privacy anymore. You did have it when that data was communicated, and that's sort of the legal label that hangs on that data. And you have this thing in law for further uses of data where you have a balancing test. So sometimes you don't really need to ask for informed consent if you're using the data for a similar purpose. And with some of the things that you got to take into account there is, are you using the data in a new context, and are you creating a new audience? A very basic example of this would be, I go to a doctor and I talk about medical problems. And then I go to the pub to talk to my friends, and the doctor comes to the pub and says, oh, guys, did you hear about Ben's foot thing or whatever? And that's using that data that I gave in that particular context is then being used in a different context to a new audience. If you think about that in the research context, if you're using hacked data and you've got great results, and you're publishing your paper and you're publishing your data set, that data set is, again, open to the world. It probably has been and used by script kiddies and whatnot. But now you're creating this new audience of researchers. So you're interpreting the data. Again, you're probably putting some of that data in your paper. So you've amplified that, the use of that data. Again, also, another thing is with these hacked data is if you use it, if you publish a paper, if that helps for your internal promotion or whatever, you're kind of condoning the act of hacking implicitly. But, and also at the same time, you're kind of incentivizing, potentially, this is maybe a bit far-fetched, but you could be incentivizing other people to also start hacking for themselves or for their own benefit, or just in general using for science as an excuse to start hacking social networks. It's a bit further and maybe a bit too far thought, but this is something to think about, that actually by using hacked data once and you gaining from it in some way, you're incentivizing others to do the same. So just because you can do certain things with data or on the internet doesn't mean you should. So this paper isn't actually being written by these researchers, but instead they're writing a case study about all the ethical discussions that they've had about this. And it sparked lots of lively discussions on mailing lists. But as I was talking about this, I had this question in mind. What if the data was from a petition website? We all know them. I've forgotten the names right now. But where you can sign up and then you see like 25,000 people sign this, and then it's presented to some politician. What if that petition website has a petition against the homosexuality laws in Uganda, where you can get a death penalty for being openly gay? If you sign that and that database is breached, and you're from Uganda, you better hide. You've basically created a database for the government to find out who is gay or who supports gays. It's maybe, again, a bit far thought, but think about what data sets you're creating. Think about what it actually means in the context, and don't just run with it. A last example, another tricky one before I go into my quick solutions, is the censorship measurement stuff. So this was a paper written recently at Georgia Tech and Princeton. What happened there was researchers implemented or gave that top code to blogs and all sorts of websites around the world. They implemented it, width 0, height 0, so it's this invisible widget. And people going to this website didn't see this thing. But what would happen is this widget would be called up, and the device of the user would try to ping lots of websites that were on a particular blocked list. They said they got the list from respectable organizations. I think it was probably the US State Department. So they were trying to see how all these different websites would be blocked around the world, whether they're blocked and how they're blocked. That's a very basic explanation of this. But the person didn't know. They were just going to a blog. Maybe troopers.de would have implemented this. So anyone going to that website is suddenly requesting thousands of potentially blocked websites somewhere without ever having a clue that that happened. So what the technologist said is like, we're using URL lists that others have used, so it must be respectable. It's like any ad tracker or any social media button that you see over the internet. You know what they do as well is they keep referring to other websites without you knowing. I guess you guys will know that, but the like button kind of just calls up Facebook and sends data to Facebook as you're browsing the internet. Also, they said, it's not human subject research. We're using people's devices. We're not actually experimenting on people. It's not psychology. It's not biomedical experiments. It's, we're just using their device as a node in the network. No one's been harmed as we were doing this, so it's all good. Then this quote, this was actually said, we will not know what governments think of this until someone ends up in jail, which really shocked a lot of the philosophers. And this is probably a very extreme view that you guys don't share, I hope. But this was said. And then when we were talking about informed consent, they said the data collection would be severely limited if they'd have to ask everyone, because likely they wouldn't join these things, because if you knew that you were, for example, in China checking all these websites that were blocked, you'd lose your plausible deniability, so therefore you wouldn't join this network research. Kind of a vague argument, but this is an example of a self-serving argument, basically. So what we then said to them is, did you actually know what was on these lists? And they had a look, and yeah, it was the Falun Gong website. People end up in jail in China or concentration camps, I think it even is, if they're a member of the Falun Gong sect. So if your device is constantly checking the Falun Gong website, and there's this government-mandated block, likely the government's keeping track of the IP addresses of people trying to access that website. And if you keep doing it, maybe, this is hypothetical, but we don't know the Chinese context that particularly well. Maybe you'll be pulled out of bed at 3 a.m. and questioned, what is your affiliation to Falun Gong? Why do you keep going to the website? Same with pornography sites. We can access pornography in Europe and the US, but in many other countries you can't, and in many other countries it's also very frowned upon religiously, and people can get kicked out of their communities. So what's legal here may be illegal or undesirable in other contexts. But you're creating a system where people are being linked to this kind of context. Ad trackers, same thing. It's great that Facebook's, for example, blocked in China. And if you see this Facebook like button, likely your browser is still trying to access Facebook, even though it's blocked. But it's not that illegal. It's just simply blocked. Other websites are highly unlawful, such as the Falun Gong website, just to take an example. And ad trackers don't send you to unlawful websites. To use a very extreme case, sometimes child pornography is illegal in Europe. There are jail sentences for it. So for some people, this is the equivalent of surfing the web, and the New York Times website or whatever, or the Frankfurter Allgemeine, sending you just to check child pornography websites, check whether they're still up. And causing the same sort of alarm with policymakers and regulators who may also not quite understand the internet that well. And then, you say no one's been harmed, but these people didn't check. They didn't go to China. They didn't have a look at what was actually happening to people who were using or who were calling up this little widget. They hadn't read anything in the news of anyone in China being arrested for this kind of stuff. But do you actually know? No, they didn't know. And then again, what actually constitutes harm? Is it jail? Like, is that the only harm that you're trying to prevent, or are there more harms? Social exclusion, for example. So here's the lawyers and philosophers again. The engineers saying, we want freedom of speech for all Chinese. We're going to create it with this. First, we're going to check what's blocked, how it's blocked. Then we're going to create the tools to circumvent it. And then philosophers saying, you're being a vigilante and you don't know what you're doing, and people could end up in jail because of your actions. You literally have no idea what's going on. Second part, and this is kind of where it leads into the next part of how we're trying to get this ethics discussion going properly, is like right now at universities and research institutions, even companies and governments, you have this notion of human subject research. And if you tick the box like, yes, I'm doing human subject research, then you have to go speak to someone and they scrutinize your research. But this last example passed ethics scrutiny at the university. Probably also because, first of all, they said they weren't human subject research. When they explained their research, they just gave a whole lot of acronyms and numbers. And on the ethics board, you had biologists and sociologists who looked at this kind of stuff and were just confused by what it actually meant. And because the box human subject research wasn't ticked, they said, okay, go for it. But what it is, what you can quite clearly see through these examples, is there can be human harming research. It's not the same definition. This is a definition that's being used in technology ethics literature at the moment. And it's harming because there's an imbalance of power and knowledge. So do engineers actually realize the power that they have? Do they know how to deal with that power that they have? And at the same time, if people are confronted, for example, with an informed consent thing on this last research, do they know what it means that if they click yes, that they're actually accessing these websites? Do they know they understand that data can be collected, that their traces can be put in database forever, basically? It's difficult to say. And then finally, what you often see with the knife example earlier, or with the ad trackers in this one, engineers are trying to use analogies to justify what they're doing. You see it in the FBI and Apple case as well, people talking about, creating a lock that opens 1 million doors or something. It's all great, but it doesn't quite hold. You can't talk about one thing and then expect the same results to apply it to your internet project. So that's something to really think about. In your analogy, are you abstracting too much from the thing that you're actually talking about? Because the actions may look similar, but technically the consequences can be very, very different. So the paper was initially rejected, the censorship one, but then because it was a computer science conference and it was a really interesting paper, the technology was great, it was very innovative, the data was interesting. So they accepted it in the end. They had to scale down the project a lot. And there was a note attached saying, we've published this because it's interesting, but don't do this again. So we're trying to limit the standard setting thing. Which begs the question, is this whole mechanism for ethics broken? And I think a lot of people are trying to see that actually they're running into issues with the stuff that they're doing. People are getting complaints. Lawyers are turning up at universities. We've had this, for example, the Facebook emotion research. I'm sure you've known it. It caused a huge, huge reputation loss for these researchers. And even in extreme cases, if people do get harmed, it can cost you your academic or your research or your engineering job. So with these projects going through, I think there is something to be said that it's currently actually quite broken in how we analyze internet research. How long have I got, by the way? Okay, cool. Okay, so excellent. So I'd just like to take you through what we've been coming up with. And this is something that we've been coming up with, not just with a bunch of lawyers sitting in a room and trying to impose it on technologists. This is what we're working on with technologists. And we're now in the final few weeks of this project where we're trying to set up these guidelines. On Friday, I'm flying from here to New York and then to San Francisco to have the final big meetings with all the engineers there. And by the end of, or by the beginning of April, we're hoping to publish a document. So I'm here for the next few days. If anyone's interested to join this process or to talk about it, please let me know. Come sit next to me at the dinner if I'm still welcome there. But so yeah, what we're doing is we're building a guideline document, and we're basing it on a few things. So you've got technology ethics, which often looked at things like nanotechnologies, these kind of things. You've got the value-sensitive design. I'm not sure if you've heard of this. It's this Batya Freeman, and I think she's in Seattle, has been working this for years and years and years, where she says, it's kind of like a privacy by design kind of project, where she says that you have to think about the values that you're affecting in the design process. And another thing that we're looking at is, or using, or being inspired by, is constructive technology assessments. These are basically technology assessments whereby stakeholders are engaged. It's actually from the Netherlands. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Netherlands, but we've got this polder model where we've got limited space. So any project, or for example, like a factory that's being set up, we don't just build the factory, we talk about to all the stakeholders in the area, what they think of it, and then we kind of, as we're designing the factory, or as we're designing the decision to where to place the factory, we've spoken to everyone and we've agreed politically on where to place a certain thing in our environment. We're trying to use these ideas and apply them to internet technologies. And the people we're speaking to are the researchers, the departments and the consortiums that are working in university, journal, and conference ethics committees who scrutinize papers. We're learning from social scientists, often about the social impact of technologies, lawyers, what's the framework within which you can work, and the ethicists, how do you reason about these things. And we encourage people to speak to local peers. So if you're running, using the extreme Ugandan case again, if you're going to create a database of people who support a particular controversial law in a country, don't just do it. Speak to the computer scientists there or other people and just ask them, this is what we intend to do. What do you think? Like, what would this mean? For us, this wouldn't mean anything. What does it mean for you or for people in your community? And regional experts, universities are full of anthropologists often who have a deep understanding of a culture. And what kind of shocked me is that engineers completely ignore that fact that just a few roads down, or maybe in the next city, there are people who have deep knowledge of the context in which you're probably going to deploy some technologies. So why don't you just have a meeting with them and just quickly, briefly ask them what this would mean for people there. You could even write a nice paper about it, about those discussions. And also speak to the affected humans. That's often through the informed consent process, but you can also see if you can actually get in contact with people who are going to be using or who are going to be your data subjects and see what this means, what you're doing, what it means for them. So this is a boring flow chart, but it's the best way I could show you what we're trying to do. So at the top left, you see what engineers often do and where they keep it. They've got an aim, they select technologies, they think about their data subjects and what data do they need, and they write about the benefits. And that's often in the ethical section, like this is going to be good because it's going to benefit so many people. Now we're suggesting this whole other framework, which is, if you see the arrows, it's iterative. I'll go through it quickly, not to bore you with all the details on this one. But per section, we've got lots of questions, and we're currently developing these questions that should make engineers think about what they're doing. Then engineers should write up a little answer to these questions, not all questions, but just the ones that are relevant. And those answers can then be used by the ethics boards or the lawyers or whoever is involved in the research design to scrutinize the assumptions made by engineers. So to quickly go through it, the first part, once you've sold your project, basically, think about what is actually the data that you're collecting, what does it mean? Are you collecting things that you shouldn't be collecting, or do you actually need all the stuff that you're collecting to answer your research question? What are the assumptions of your technologies? Looking at the blockchain stuff with my list of criticisms and their assumptions, tease out some of the assumptions that you have. And reflect on them for a second. And once you've done that, you kind of look at the context in which you may be deploying these technologies, and you look at the power structures in these societies. Here, for example, in Germany, you've got the rule of law, you've got independent judges, politicians, and you name it. It's probably not the same in the country in which you're deploying things. So understand, if you're implementing the system, who is going to have access to the data, or who can potentially attack the system and get the data, And what would that mean? Would it amplify the power position? Would it shift the power positions? Think about the risks of harm, as I said earlier. You don't just identify harms, but also define them, like understand what harms actually are in the context in which you're using certain technologies. Laws are often seen to be annoying and in the way, but oftentimes they're legitimate, and they've been created through democratic processes often, or whatever the process may be in a particular country, but they're seen as legitimate. So you really need a strong case if you're going to breach laws. Also think about the values that you're affecting. And once you know all that, you've got your ethical functional requirements. So I won't go through these, but these are just a few of the questions. Just explain what you're creating, what are the benefits for society, but also specific stakeholders. So don't just say, we're creating this project because it's awesome, but say like, this group is going to have this benefit, and that group's going to have that benefit. The power analysis, understand the social, cultural, and political system. And then you get to the second part where once you've got these functional requirements of high level, you understand them. What you often see in technology or in computer science papers is a section about this long on privacy when they're developing privacy enhancing technologies, for example, saying this is privacy and referencing 2 papers. My doctoral works on privacy, and I can tell you it's not, the definition isn't this. And it's a hugely complicated concept. It's not just, we're collecting information and we're keeping it secure, so therefore privacy is being respected. I'm not going to go into it now, but try and understand the values that you're actually impacting and take them apart and see which part of those values you're actually impacting. Because likely you're not just impacting privacy, you're using particular information in a new context, for example, which is a part of this whole big definition of privacy. And then the second part, you look at the technologies. So which technological choices that you have actually affect the values and the parts of the values. So, create the link there. And then start thinking about de-identification methods and that kind of stuff. And at the end, state your moral dilemmas. This is a famous one. The trolley problem, some of you may know it, but this is how to state a moral dilemma. So a trolley is running out of control down its track. In its path are 5 people who've been tied to the track by a mad philosopher. But you're there, you're the one in power, you can switch a flip, so the trolley is going to go down another track, and those 5 people are going to be saved, but unfortunately on the other track, 1 person has been tied by this mad professor. So what do you do? Do you flip the switch or not? This is an internet research moral dilemma, but this is how often moral dilemmas arise. You've got 2 options. They're both equally good, equally bad, or one is worse than the other. And you're in a position of power to do something about it, but you're not quite sure which direction to take. So that's how you can start thinking about how the technology affecting these values. The benefit would be this, the harm would be this. What do we do? In these guidelines, then we ask researchers to assess the moral dilemmas. So first, what's your common sense answer? And often that's an interesting one to look at. And then we ask, we've got all these little modules explaining concepts, but what does consequentialism tell you about this dilemma that you're faced? And what would deontology tell you? So what would ends justifying the means type thinking tell you about this? And what would a more sort of engaged, what are the social effects of these decisions? And can you, some people may be advanced ethicists, so are there any other ethical theories that you could apply to this to try and these theories don't solve the issue, but they shed light on it. They give you a lens on what the effects are of these decisions that you're about to make. And then the final part really is, you've got these moral dilemmas, so you look at a few things such as the scope of the project. Can you change the scope? Do you change the research question? Can you change the amount of countries you're deploying your project in? Can you use different technologies maybe that do a similar thing but don't impact the values that you've identified? Also look at methodology. Once you've got all these alternatives listed, this is quite a creative process. Probably would also best be done with some colleagues. And then you go through some of the previous steps again, and you see, what is the impact of this technology? What's the impact? if we change the scope of data collection. And at the end, you justify your decisions. So that some moral dilemmas will likely remain. You can't solve everything. Not everything, everything in life contains some risk, including researchers. So ethics boards usually understand that. But it's sort of explaining to them which steps you've taken and which steps you haven't taken to mitigate all concerns. Write it up in an informed consent sheet and then start your research. So I was looking at the logo. When it says, make the world a safer place, that's brilliant. But I think the point I was trying to make here is that you need the super skills of an engineer, definitely, to do that. But at the same time, you need some kind of moral framework to actually make it a safer place and not cause unexpected consequences with the stuff that you're doing. So yeah, I'm really glad that Enno's invited me here for this one, because I met Enno at a conference where I spoke about this, and then he came to a workshop, and he's really engaged with these questions. And at the workshop where Enno was at, we had about 50, 60 people maybe, 30 computer scientists who have all understood that this is something to actually start engaging with, actually start creating a moral framework to achieve this, basically, because all good researchers want this. So instead of your standard cat picture, I use the pug today. So please help. We've got 3 more weeks, I think, to finish this project. So I'm really glad that I'm here, and I'm really glad that I could present this now to you. If you want to have a look at the work we've done so far, please come find me. Send me an email if you want. My first name is actually Ben Dirk, but people in England don't understand that, so I just use Ben. But yeah, do be in touch. I'd love to speak to everyone who's interested, especially also people who fundamentally disagree with everything I've just said. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This was exactly what I was hoping for.
Cool.
Thank you. Very happy about this. This was a good way to get into Troopers, and so it's. I would say we can start with the conference. Thanks again, Ben.
That was good. But now for my keynote. Maybe my face might seem familiar to you. But we'll get to that later. It's so convenient, Snowball, to have all these nice people gathered here. Look at them, Snowball. Just look at them. What a pathetic industry this is. Look at these people who rant about privacy, but keep carrying tracking devices in their pockets. Look at these people who always complain about budgets, but get $1 million boxes for their data centers without knowing what they do. Look at that no good younger brother of mine, talking about, oh, how the halting problem is undecidable, instead of actually getting out there and selling solutions. And finally getting a volcano of his own. This industry needs to be put out of its misery. Don't you agree? Don't you agree, my precious? Luckily, I'm here, and I'm going to do it. Кто хорошая кошка? Кто хорошая кошка? Кто лопает так, что за ушами трещит? Look at them, Snowball. Look at them, Snowball. And how am I going to do this, you ask? Well, by submerging the world in the 0 day, of course. What the world needs is 0 day. Even now, my minions are mining a huge mother lode of it left in Antarctica from prehistoric times. Now, they will upload it through a series of pipes to the internet, and soon Soon, the whole world will be drowning in 0 day. 0 day will be so high that there will be tides of it, deluges of it, mountains of it. Your puny skills will not help anyone. You might think, what does this have to do with you? Well, but guess from whose name I'm going to release it all? Yours. And now that you're branded as arms dealers and the Wassenaar police is breaking down your doors, who will the world turn to? Why, me, of course, and my company, the Fishball. Maker of the 0 day killing robot, the ZKB. Unit 26G, remove the 0 day. Works for Windows and Android and even BlackBerry. Can you match his speed? I knew you couldn't. Units for the Mac are sold separately. iZKB001, remove the I0 day. See, can you match this? I knew you couldn't. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Kills 0 day, leaves buildings standing. Ladies and gentlemen of the cyber, the governments of the world, the Fishbowl, the one and only. Now you may think that I'm just an old man on the screen, that I can't touch you. Oh, but I can, and I will.
To some degree, I'm as caught by surprise as much as you are. There have been strange things going on in the last days. It was like setting up troopers this time was a bit like the cyclists in the wind. You struggle, and there's always like blows and obstacles coming up of all types of technical nature, which is why we, for some precaution, we established a CERT this time at Troopers. And these guys are out there to... So apparently, it seems Troopers is, I would say, under attack. And our challenge in the next 2 days will be to fight back this attack. Go to the website, look what is needed, and let's repel that evil guy, which we should be able to do given we are troopers. Enjoy the conference.
We are troopers.